Hello there. Today I want to take a look at what I hope is going to be a great value wine from Washington State in the United States. So we're in the northeast corner of the US, sort of inland from Seattle and Portland. So this is Columbia Crest's Grand Estates Columbia Valley Syrah from 2018. In general, as a producing region, Washington has a reputation, although there are some really high quality wines. A lot of Washington's production is sort of great value because you have an inland dry continental climate that with irrigation regularly produces fruit which has good colour, good flavour without too much disease risk, and you know, you can use sort of relatively mechanised viticulture. Columbia Crest, one of the older and larger wineries of this region. It was founded in 1983 and made its first wine in 1984. Released its first wine in 1984. Sorry. Part of a larger group, the Chateau Ste Wine Estates group, and that group has been through some change recently. It was owned for a long period by Philip Morris Tobacco Company, whose they became another company, and then they sold it on when they got into difficulties to a New York venture capital group called Sycamore, and Sycamore have put a fair amount of investment into the group in general and seem to be turning things around quite nicely. Columbia Crest, as a result of its relationship with Chateau Ste, has tended to be a producer of reasonable quality, everyday drinking wines. They have a range of wines that are more expressive of the different AVAs from Washington, but in general they're large blends. So hence this one is labelled as being from the Columbia Valley, which is quite an all-encapsulating AVA. In fact, their winery is in an AVA called the Horse Heaven Hills AVA, and the notes I've seen on this wine is that evidently most of the fruit for this wine comes from these premium parts of the Columbia Valley, but it allows them the latitude to blend in wines from elsewhere, I guess. The wine is, it says it's 100% Syrah, but then they say that it's hand-picked, pressed, and during maceration, which goes on for about a week or so, skins of Viognier are included. So presumably there's 2 to 3% of Viognier in there, not a large amount, but that's actually quite a useful. The co-fermentation of white and red is quite a useful way of fixing tannins and increasing acidity in a red wine. So it's quite common to ferment a small amount of Viognier and macerate Viognier with Syrah. The wines are made in tank. They're pumped over a couple of times a day, probably to ensure extraction during ferment, and then they run off into oak, combination of new and old barrels, with a combination of French and American oak. So the American oak tending to give more of a sort of a vanilla-y note, and the French more backbone and structure. I should imagine this particular wine, given its price point, is more likely to be more American oak because it's cheaper, and more older oak as well. So I'm not expecting a huge amount of influence of oak, but I think there should be some that's notable there. Looking at it, it's got a lovely deep dark colour, vivid purple rim there, so it's a sort of a red purple colour. It's 14.5% alcohol. It's fairly viscous. It's clinging to the side of the glass there. Although the tears are forming quite slowly, but they are actually they're there. In terms of depth of colour, I can't see through it. This is virtually opaque. In terms of the aromas, let's see what we've got there. So you've got quite a sort of a vivid, juicy black fruit, black cherry, black plum, those sorts of, I'd say, very juicy styles of fruit. But overlaying that, you've got spicy notes of cedary oak, so cedary spices, cinnamon, I suppose, that sort of thing, but also meaty touches, There might be a tiny touch of sort of Bretty mousiness as well, but not marring it, just enough to give a little bit of complexity, a little bit of sort of tertiary character. So let's have a taste. Tasting that's juicy, ripe, fresh. It's almost like a sort of a blackcurrant lozenge. It's starting to get a little bit of cedary texture in terms of tannic grip along the back palate there, which is slightly grainy. I'd say they're nicely handled tannins, but the majority of this is quite fresh, so there's quite lively acidity there, lifting the fruit, which is good. Alcohol seems reasonably balanced, actually. It's not particularly... The finish is slightly hot, but not very. I mean, this has a mid-weight of quite velvety fruit. I mean, it's a little bit of sort of drying, dusty tannin there, but most of it is velvety textured and ripe. It's those ripe black fruits. There's almost a sort of slightly chocolatey element, and hints of vanilla, again, from the oak, vanilla and cedar, just coming through at the finish. The wine's of medium intensity. It's lasting fairly well. This is a good value wine. It's nicely rounded out. I wonder if there's a slight sweetness on the front palate, just to round it off and just to flatter it a little to hide some of its astringency. If not, that's just roundness, richness, ripeness, and possibly a little bit of glycerol, which will seem like a little bit like sugar. But I think with those caveats, this is a really nice wine for drinking now. I mean, 2018 is probably pretty much at optimum. You keep it for a couple of years, but I don't think this is going to improve particularly. So yes, Columbia Crest Grand Estates 2018 Syrah from the Columbia Valley AVA. If you found this interesting, do please feel free to like and share. Thank you for watching, and do join us again. Bye now.